returning from his military service in World War II. And in an effort to make sense of his recent experience, my father began seriously to explore existentialism, a school of philosophical thought that was popular in the post-war years. And so growing up, I remember the large bookcase built out of bricks and pine boards in our farmhouse living room and the intriguing titles of some of the many books contained therein. Being and Nothingness, The Myth of Sisyphus, The Unnameable, Nausea, The Plague. Now, occasionally, Dad would allude to the ideas contained in these strange books during our spirited dinner table discussions. And thus, my siblings and I were exposed early on to the rather bleak worldviews of Albert Camus, Samuel Beckett, and Jean-Paul Sartre. It would be years before I was capable of reading and assessing this literature on my own, and thus able to appreciate its subversiveness. And while there are different schools of existentialist thought, the one preferred by my father was profoundly skeptical about the possibility of discovering any sort of overarching meaning, purpose, or active concern in the cosmos. And representative of this outlook, this school of thought, was Albert Camus, who pointed to the fundamental absurdity of the human condition. In a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, he said, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. The divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, Camus writes, is properly the feeling of absurdity. For his part, Jean-Paul Sartre describes the existentialist predicament in these stark psychological terms: anguish, forlornness, despair. These are the emotions that beset us when the full impact of life's absurdity strikes home. Now, anguish arises from the fact that responsibility for the fate of the world, that responsibility lies entirely with us. Forlornness follows from the awareness that there are no eternal transcendental values to which we can make final appeal. And finally, we are cast into despair because there is nothing dependable, nothing we can count on outside of our own actions. Man is nothing other than his plan, Sartre wrote. He exists only to the extent that he fulfills himself. Now, one would suppose that sentiments such as these would ultimately produce a profound pessimism and spiritual resignation. But Sartre argues just the opposite. There is no doctrine more optimistic, he says, since man's destiny is within himself. We are dealing, he says, with an ethics of action and complete commitment. What existentialism stands for, according to Sartre, is a tough, realistic optimism rather than a tender and vulnerable one that is based largely on illusions. Clearly, this is very different from the outlook that the theistic traditions of the West have always upheld. Judaism, Christianity, Islam all feature an intelligent, active deity who created and maintains the cosmos, who steers it in a purposeful and discernible direction, who shows an interest in its human inhabitants. For religions such as these, Houston Smith writes, the world is meaningful throughout, and the drama of personal and social existence is lived out within the context of a continual cosmic and spiritual meaning. According to Peter Berger, a well-known sociologist of religion, religion has historically performed the vital function of locating a human being's life in an ultimately meaningful order. When the individual feels dislocated, when he or she is deprived of the security that comes from being part of a larger system that makes sense, a system that is ultimately protective and dependable, when he loses this, he also loses his bearings and is no longer sure exactly what to do with himself. The individual feels out to sea and adrift. Traditional religion provides us with an orientation and an ultimate conviction of the world's rightness. And this, says Berger, reinforces the roles that we are expected to play in society. And it invests those roles with more than subjective personal significance. And thus we pursue our vocations. We raise our children. We donate money to charity. We fight for our country because somehow we feel that it is not just our private values and feelings, but the cosmos itself that is aligned with and that approves of our efforts. Now, to be sure, even within the Judeo-Christian tradition, there have been doubters. The author of Ecclesiastes is perhaps the best known of those doubters. It's always seemed somewhat remarkable to me that this particular book ever made it into the biblical canon, for its description of the human condition and of human prospects is utterly at odds with the views presented elsewhere in the good book. Ecclesiastes questions the claim that goodness is rewarded and evil surely punished, or that God hates oppression and looks after his own. Beyond eating and drinking and sleeping and working and loving, there is little else that redeems life, Ecclesiastes says. And to expect anything beyond the basics is just vanity and a chasing after the wind. And in fact, these ideas were unsettling enough that a later writer attached an epilogue to the book of Ecclesiastes that basically cancels out the author's earlier claims. But how necessary is it for our own human well-being to have some sort of guarantee of cosmic meaning and purpose and caring? The philosopher John Gray points out that neither ancient pagan culture nor the major non-Western religious traditions have developed any comparable kind of doctrine. The idea that history has meaning, Gray says, is a Christian prejudice. Many modern scientists would undoubtedly agree. As the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg famously declared, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless. And in her book, The Sacred Depths of Nature, biologist Ursula Goodenough, a practicing Episcopalian, by the way, she concedes that nature has no creator, no superordinate meaning, no purpose other than life's continuance. Still, Goodenough says, the world is worthy of our admiration and our reverence just as it is, meaningful or not. I suppose that religious conservatives, whether Christian or Muslim, resist so adamantly the theory of evolution and many of the other insights of modern science because they are afraid. They fear that the facts revealed by science will lead to a disconfirmation of their faith, a faith in the cosmos that is under God's watchful eye and where everything happens for a reason. Now, however, in reflecting upon the universe and its potential for meaning and morality, a different issue arises that is an even bigger stumbling block than science, and that issue is theodicy. Our English term theodicy combines two Greek terms, theo, meaning God, and dike, meaning justice, God's justice. The classic formulation of the theodicy problem was spelled out earlier in the selection that Sarah and I shared from Norman Cousins, but let me restate it very briefly. If the universe is governed by an all-powerful, infinitely loving, unerringly righteous being, then why is there so much injustice, so much gratuitous, undeserved suffering in our universe? One must conclude that if there is a God, either he is not all-powerful, or else he just doesn't care that much. Now, Jewish and Christian thinkers have been trying to resolve this particular conundrum for centuries. The author of Ecclesiastes, well, he gave up on it. And while he did not explicitly deny the existence of God, he did question the Almighty's role as an active moral arbiter in human affairs. New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, who serves as chair of the religion department at the University of North Carolina, he admits that this is the issue that caused him to lose his faith. Now, Bart Ehrman was raised a conservative Christian, and he was taught as a youngster never to question biblical teachings, to accept them as literally true and unfailingly accurate. And Ehrman was able to maintain those convictions through his post-secondary training at the Moody Bible Institute. But he says. His faith began to waver as he pursued graduate studies in religion at Princeton University, because here, critical studies received much greater emphasis than at Moody. And so Ehrman became aware of the inconsistencies, the discrepancies, the contradictions, the just plain errors that permeate the biblical text. And yet he felt, ultimately, that his faith could withstand all of those particular threats. What ultimately caused a collapse of his belief system was the simple and undeniable facts of life. Eventually, he writes, I felt compelled to leave Christianity altogether, and I did not go easily. On the contrary, he says, I left kicking and screaming, wanting desperately to hold on to the evangelical faith that I had known since childhood. But, he says, I could not deny the fact that for many people who inhabit this planet, life is a cesspool of misery and suffering. And I came to the point where I simply could not believe that there is this good, kindly disposed ruler who is in charge of it all. Now, I don't know if there is a God, he says, but I think that if there is one, he certainly is not the one proclaimed by the Judeo-Christian tradition, the one who is actively and powerfully involved in the world. I have been thinking intensely about these questions for many, many years. I've heard all the answers, and although I thought that I once knew and was satisfied with those answers, I am no longer. Now, like Ehrman and the author of Ecclesiastes, I too am hard-pressed to identify and to defend the thesis of a morally concerned and caring entity of infinite proportions. Yes, we can fall back on that old adage that the Lord works in mysterious ways his wonders to perform, but ultimately that is nothing but a cop-out. It is not a satisfactory explanation, and it succeeds only in letting God off the hook for human and animal suffering. But you know, frankly, I've always been less concerned about the disposition of the universe than with our own indifference as human beings. The latter is what we should really be focusing upon, because unlike God's putative indifference, it is a problem that we can address and do something about. Now, perhaps we do need to imagine that there is a powerful metaphysical parent who is anxious about our well-being because we have so little faith in our own human capacity for caring. But as long as we look to God for assurances of unfaltering love and ultimate justice, we may fail to own up to our own responsibility toward our world and toward each other. Now, here's a thought for you. The philosopher Robert Solomon has argued that while a person does not necessarily need to believe in a just and loving God in order to experience a degree of equanimity and to live a constructive life, while you don't necessarily need to believe that, you do need to be capable of trust. Because distrust, he says, breeds disharmony and alienation, and extreme distrust, paranoia, makes life unbearable. And then Solomon goes on to draw a distinction between blind trust, the trust of an inexperienced child or perhaps of a fanatic, and, on the other hand, authentic trust. And authentic trust, he suggests, involves a rational decision on our part to trust, and it is trust performed with the eyes wide open. It is authentic because it is neither simple nor naive, he says. And with a trust like this, we are able to affirm the world just as it presents itself to us, free of illusions, free of exaggerated hopes or irrational fears, while also affirming our own power to make a difference. Here's an example. We've all seen all those T-shirts and sports bottles that feature smiling caricatures of people jogging and biking and sailing and skating, pictures accompanied by that pithy phrase, "Life is good." Now, it requires a healthy measure of trust to make such a statement, because yes, life is also unpredictable, life is also fraught with suffering and disappointment and loss. But as Norman Cousins indicates, it is still, despite all of this, incumbent upon us to trust that life is good, if only to justify this precious gift and to place ourselves in life's service. Indifference and lack of trust go hand in hand. If we do not possess sufficient trust in our own capabilities, if we deny the claims that life makes upon us, it is quite likely that we will cease to care, that we will become indifferent. Because if I lack confidence, trust in my own agency, caring will just leave me feeling angry and frustrated. And truth be told, we do see a whole lot of anger and frustration in our world today, accompanied by a refusal to take responsibility and to exercise our native powers. And I was reminded of this when I and several other members of this congregation attended the YWCA's annual Racial Justice Summit that was held at the Concourse Hotel just a few days ago. This was an eye-opening experience for someone who has lived for 25 years with the illusion that Madison and Dane County are bastions of progressive social policy, that my community is one in which people genuinely care about each other regardless of race, ethnicity, or class, that glaring disparities that are commonly found in less enlightened communities aren't really a problem for us here in Madison. Ignorance and indifference. There's really no other name for it. When, at the start of this particular summit, two researchers from the Wisconsin Conference on Children and Families shared the preliminary results of a year-long study of socioeconomic indicators in Dane County, surprise and then shock registered on many faces in the audience, in particular the white faces in that audience. Some of you may have read a synopsis of the Race to Equity report in the newspaper maybe a week and a half ago. But here are just a few highlights in case you missed it. As of 2011, black unemployment in Dane County was 5 times that of white unemployment. The chances of a black child living in poverty in Dane County were 13 times that of a white child. Black juveniles in our county are arrested at 6 times the rate of white juveniles. Black children's rate of third-grade reading proficiency is less than a quarter that of white third graders. And while 84% of white students graduate from high school on time, barely half of African American students do. There were many, many more statistics like this. And taken together, they placed Madison and Dane County at or near the bottom of the heap in terms of racial achievement and equity. Milwaukee does better. Chicago does better. Atlanta, Dallas, and Birmingham do better. So no, I am less interested in and concerned about cosmic indifference than our own, because those percentages are staggering, they are shameful, and they belong to us. And here is where I would submit that the existentialists have a point to make. It would be easy to fall into deep pessimism about conditions here in Dane County. But what we really need isn't pessimism. We need a tougher optimism, one that no longer enjoys the luxury of liberal illusions and selective vision. To repeat that earlier quotation from Jean-Paul Sartre, since man's destiny is within himself, we are dealing here with an ethics of action and involvement. For many, that Racial Justice Summit served as an overdue wake-up call, which one hopes will produce a community-wide sense of mission and a renewed commitment by progressives to walk their talk. I trust, and there's that word again, I trust that First Unitarian Society will play its part in closing this equity gap. We do not need to believe in a caring God in order to believe in and care for one another. Or, as Julian Green once wrote, is there anything whatsoever that we can cling to? Amid the chaos of illusions into which we are cast headlong, there is one thing that always stands out as true, and that is love.